7:41 p.m., Christmas Eve, Prague. Beneath the giant Christmas tree, billionaire CEO Alexander Voss, 44, stood rigid and alone. He was trapped in his gilded cage of success, paralyzed by the silence of a life with no connections. Nearby, single dad Michael Turner and his 6-year-old son Ben gave bread to the homeless. Ben saw the isolated man and pulled his father aside. "Dad says lonely people need friends." Ben offered the CEO his cup of hot cocoa. Alexander was stunned. He had everything. But this simple act of grace was the one thing he truly needed. The Christmas he'd lost began its return. Michael Turner, 39, wore the quiet weariness of a man who fought his battles with dignity. He was an incredibly talented part-time electrician. His hands were strong, calloused from years of gripping wires and tools. But they were also gentle hands, the only ones his son Ben had known since the accident. 3 years ago, just 2 weeks before Christmas, a drunk driver had stolen Michael's wife and Ben's mother. The loss was not merely painful, it was defining. It fractured their world but forced Michael to build a new one, sturdy and moral, around his son. After the accident, Michael made a conscious, deliberate choice. He stopped chasing long-term, high-paying construction contracts. Those jobs demanded long hours and often took him out of the city. His priorities shifted entirely. He became a freelance troubleshooter, fixing sudden power outages in old apartment buildings and small business wiring, taking jobs only when they allowed him to pick Ben up from school at 3:15 p.m. sharp. This choice meant their life was perpetually tight. They rented a tiny 2-room apartment where the smell of old coffee and electrical tape perpetually lingered. Their bank account often hovered just above zero. The heating bill was a recurring nightmare that always arrived too close to the due date. Christmas was no longer about expensive toys or designer clothes. His choice to prioritize Ben meant living on the sharp edge of financial instability, a deliberate sacrifice. But Michael viewed this financial fragility as a proving ground for his most important lesson. That worth was measured not by assets, but by empathy. Michael had replaced material inheritance with something far more profound, the inheritance of kindness. He taught Ben the philosophy that had saved his own sanity. We don't have much, but we can always share. This year, their Christmas tradition had been executed with Michael's characteristic quiet precision. They had spent the entire afternoon making 2 large pots of simple, nourishing lentil soup and wrapping up day-old bread donated by a local bakery. They weren't feeding the homeless out of duty. They were doing it out of gratitude. Gratitude for the warmth they still possessed, for the father-son bond that survived, and for the simple, undeniable fact that they were together. Ben, 6 years old, absorbed his father's lesson like a sponge. He had the kind of bright, open-hearted curiosity that made the world a more immediate, tactile place. He understood need. He saw the cold, and he saw the difference a warm cup of soup made to a shivering person. As they walked through the brightly lit square, the air was thick with the manufactured magic of Christmas, shoppers rushing past, laughter echoing from an expensive restaurant, and the loud, cheerful, commercial pulse of the holiday. Michael felt the stark contrast. The billion-dollar tree stood as a monument to consumption, while their small act of sharing happened in the shadows, unnoticed by the hurried crowd. But Ben's eyes were not on the glittering displays. They were on the quiet corners. They had one final mission: deliver the last dozen foil-wrapped bread slices. That was when Ben saw him. Alexander Voss. The CEO stood out from the crowd not because of his expensive, custom-tailored coat, but because of his stillness. He was an island of cold granite in a rushing river of human warmth. He wasn't looking at the tree. He was looking through it, his face a mask of deep, ingrained isolation. He looked powerful, yet utterly vacant. Michael tried to steer Ben away from the imposing figure. He didn't want his son to bother such an important man. But Ben resisted, his small, gloved hand pulling hard on Michael's sleeve. Ben's eyes were fixed on the lonely man. "Daddy," Ben whispered, his voice small but insistent, pointing with his free hand. "He's standing all alone. He didn't get any bread." "He's okay, Ben. He's probably just waiting for someone very important." Ben shook his head, his logic simple and pure. "No, My teacher says if you stand still for too long, you're waiting for someone who isn't coming. He repeated the core lesson Michael had instilled in him, the philosophical bedrock of their existence. Dad says lonely people need friends. Before Michael could intervene further, Ben had gently pulled his hand free and walked toward the CEO. He carried his own half-full cup of hot cocoa, which Michael had bought as a treat, a luxury they usually save for home. Ben's final act of generosity had been to grab a napkin and quickly scrawl a message on the bread's wrapper, a small artifact of his father's teaching. The inscription, written in unsteady blue crayon, declared, "Friends make Christmas warm." He didn't offer that to Alexander. He walked to the CEO with just the cup, the warmth of the cardboard a stark contrast to the billionaire's cold hands. Michael stood watching, his breath caught in his throat. He saw the potential for dismissal, for rudeness, for the cold snap of the real world to reject his son's offering. But he couldn't call Ben back. He knew that the single most important thing he could ever give his son was the freedom to be truly kind, even if it cost them a moment of embarrassment. He had taught the lesson, now he had to trust the student. Alexander Voss lived inside a fortress of efficiency. His world was governed by EBITDA, market fluctuations, and hostile takeover defenses. Emotions were liabilities. Connection was leverage. He built Voss Industries from a small tech startup into a global powerhouse by keeping people at a strategic arm's-length distance. He didn't just stand alone. He chose to stand alone. Isolation was his shield and his strategy. Tonight, Christmas Eve, should have been a triumph. He had successfully negotiated the merger of two massive European energy firms. He was expected to be on his private jet, heading to a tropical island to celebrate his victory. Instead, he was stranded. His board, sensing weakness after a minor stock dip, had pressured him into staying in Prague to finalize a series of non-critical documents, a calculated move to remind him he was replaceable. He stared at the magnificent Christmas tree, but all he saw was a complicated structure of temporary materials, lights that drained excessive power, and a marketing spectacle. He heard the carols, but they were just background noise to the crushing silence of his own mind. He had all the money, all the power, and absolutely no place to go. The polished marble of the square, the cold air, and the distant tinny music combined to create a profound sense of existential dread. He felt physically heavy, as if the weight of his entire multinational corporation was pressing down on his chest. His heart, usually a metronome of calculated ambition, felt like a hollow echoing chamber. This wasn't the victory he had worked for decades for. It was the ultimate luxurious defeat, the realization that his success had systematically eradicated his ability to feel joy. When the small voice cut through the noise, Alexander felt an instinctive recoil. He saw the child, the cheap worn clothes, the father hovering anxiously in the distance, and prepared his standard, dismissive response. He was about to offer a crisp banknote to make the problem, the intrusion, go away. But then Ben spoke, not asking for anything, but offering a profound truth. My dad says when people stand alone, it means they need a friend. Alexander stopped. The phrase hit him with the force of an unpredicted market crash. It bypassed his intellect, his cynicism, and his carefully constructed emotional defenses. He wasn't being asked for money or advantage. He was being seen. The child was offering his most prized possession, the warmth of his cocoa. Alexander hesitated for a long moment. Then slowly, painfully, he lowered his hand and accepted the cup. His fingers, accustomed to the cool polish of custom phones and high-grade leather, curled around the warm cardboard. He felt the heat immediately. It was more than temperature. It was connection. He found himself staring at the cup, dumbfounded. The sheer lack of agenda in Ben's eyes was a shock to his system. For Alexander, every human interaction was a chess move. This was simply a gift, an offering of pure warmth, a concept so foreign it felt like an alien language. Michael rushed forward, his face flushed with embarrassment. I apologize, sir. Ben, that was rude. We were just sharing with the others. He has a habit of speaking his mind. Alexander shook his head, looking from the child's earnest face to the father's worried, humble one. He realized Michael wasn't protecting his status. He was protecting his child from the disappointment of adult rejection. Alexander spoke, his voice rough from disuse, the sound foreign to his own ears. No, he's right. He looked directly at Michael, a gaze that had terrified CEOs across continents. He is perfectly right. I am waiting for someone who isn't coming. He took a tentative sip of the cocoa. It tasted like cheap chocolate, too much sugar, and utterly perfect. He gestured to the cold, uncomfortable public bench nearby, the one everyone avoided for the more cheerful, crowded parts of the square. Please, do you have a minute? I need to understand that philosophy. Michael, still uncomfortable but unable to refuse the clear, desperate plea in the man's eyes, sat down. Ben immediately sandwiched himself between them, as if protecting a new friend from the cold. The conversation that followed was unlike anything Alexander had experienced in 20 years. It wasn't transactional. It wasn't about status. It was simple, raw humanity. Michael talked about the challenge of being a single parent, the constant juggle of work and school plays, the crushing pressure of keeping a promise to a dead wife. He spoke about the tricky work of chasing down elusive short circuits and how to make a decent tomato soup. He didn't complain about his poverty. He spoke proudly of his moral wealth. Alexander listened, his body language slowly thawing. He realized this man's problems were immediate, solvable, and real. Michael's battles were with physics and bills. Alexander's battles were with abstract power and betrayal. The emptier, more corrosive kind of conflict. Ben, utterly at ease, started drawing on the napkin that wrapped the remaining slice of bread. He held the cocoa cup in his hands, using the warmth to keep his small fingers limber. Alexander looked down at the simple paper cup in his hands. He realized he was still clutching it with both hands, tightly, possessively, the simple, cheap warmth. He remembered the exquisite, bespoke coffee cups he owned, lined with platinum. They were cold, always cold. Alexander held the cup with two hands, the first time he had felt true, unearned warmth in years. He had spent his life acquiring things that were impressive but cold. This simple cardboard cup, shared with an utterly kind stranger and his open-hearted son, was the first thing that truly warmed him. The cocoa was gone, but the feeling lingered, profound and shocking. The past and the awakening, word count 1281. The night deepened. The square began to empty out. Michael and Ben were Alexander's only remaining company. The CEO, who commanded the attention of global markets, found himself giving his undivided focus to a 6-year-old's detailed explanation of why the biggest snow pile was the best snow pile. Ben, seeing Alexander was now a captive audience, became inquisitive. His questions were not meant to pry. They were meant to understand why his new friend was not surrounded by people who loved him. Why are you alone? Don't you have friends? Alexander swallowed hard. He looked at the vast empty space around him. He realized that every single person he employed, every competitor, and every former associate was either intimidated by him or wanted something from him. He had no friends. He only had transactions. He felt an urge to tell the truth, a desperate need to offload the burden of his success. He started slowly, his voice quiet, almost lost in the vastness of the square. He spoke about his childhood for the first time in 30 years. He grew up in an extreme poverty that Michael could barely imagine. His parents were gone before he was 10. His Christmases were spent in the unforgiving environment of an industrial orphanage in a bleak gray town. There were no lights, no gifts, and certainly no shared cocoa. He remembered one Christmas Eve when he was 7. He had been given a single broken wooden train piece as a charity gift. Another boy, larger and crueler, had taken it, laughing as he snapped it in half. That night, alone on a cold cot, Alexander made a silent, sacred vow. Twist 1. The vow of isolation. I made a promise to myself, Alexander admitted, his voice cracking slightly. I swore I would build a life so strong, so powerful, and so rich that I would never, ever have to rely on anyone for anything. If you don't need people, they can't hurt you. If you are strong enough, no one can steal your joy. He looked at Michael. I kept that vow. I won. I have everything I swore I would get. But tonight, standing here, All I can see is that I succeeded in building a fortress, and I locked myself inside. Michael didn't offer a platitude. He simply placed a gentle hand on Alexander's coat sleeve, a gesture of simple, unvarnished human sympathy. The walls you build to keep sadness out, sir, they also keep joy out. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the sharp, insistent ring of Alexander's work phone, which he had deliberately placed on the bench to silence his mind. It was his assistant, Marcus, the contract signing. Alexander answered, his face instantly reverting to the CEO mask, cold, sharp, and commanding. Yes, Marcus. Mr. Voss, they are ready. The European teams are waiting in the video conference room. You need to return to the hotel immediately. This merger is worth 5 billion euros. We can't delay the signing. Marcus's voice was frantic, laced with the panic of a man whose bonus depended on Alexander's swift compliance. Alexander stood up. This was it, the moment of truth. He had to choose, the fortress or the friend. Ben, who heard the sharp, demanding tone in the CEO's voice, looked up, his face clouding over with disappointment and familiar loss. Are you leaving? The question was a gentle accusation. It wasn't about the money. It was about the promise of friendship. Ben was asking if Alexander was going back to the place where he was lonely. Alexander looked at the phone in his hand, the key to 5 billion euros. He looked at Michael, the man who valued honesty and kindness above all else. He looked at Ben, the small, brave ambassador of human connection. He remembered the feeling of the warm cocoa cup. He took a deep breath, the cold air filling his lungs. A faint flush of color, the first sign of blood flow returning to his previously stone-cold face, appeared on his cheeks. He walked 3 steps away toward the empty fountain and stood there facing the corporate world on the other end of the line. Twist 2. Climax. The ultimate choice. Then, slowly, deliberately, and with the kind of clarity he hadn't possessed since he was a 7-year-old making a vow, he made a new choice. He raised the phone, but instead of speaking to Marcus, he pressed the power button. The simple click of the power button was the sound of a 5 billion euro deal dissolving, the sound of his old life's most fundamental principle being shattered. Every fiber of his old hyper-capitalist self screamed in protest, but the memory of the cocoa's warmth, the sincerity of Ben's gaze, held him firm. The screen went dark. The ringtone ceased. Alexander Voss, the man who never missed an opportunity, who lived for the deal, had just shut down his connection to 5 billion euros. He turned back to Michael and Ben. He walked back to the cold, uncomfortable wooden bench. He sat down. He spoke, his voice quiet but resonant with the weight of an immense, personal decision. I think I want to stay. Michael stared, dumbfounded. The most powerful man he had ever encountered had chosen a hard wooden bench and a small boy over a 5 billion euro deal. It wasn't just a choice of comfort. It was a rejection of his entire life's philosophy. Ben, however, understood immediately. The threat of loneliness was gone. He beamed, a smile so radiant it outshone the Christmas tree lights. He scooted closer to Alexander, resting his head against the CEO's expensive coat. Good, Ben said simply. Now you're not alone. Alexander Voss, the master of the universe, felt a strange, unfamiliar moisture gather in his eyes. He had just lost his biggest deal of the quarter, but for the first time in 30 years, he felt like he had actually won something. The 2 men and the boy left the central square together. The atmosphere had shifted from cold obligation to quiet, shared destiny. Alexander insisted on hailing a cab, a request Michael resisted but ultimately yielded to, knowing their small rental apartment was far away. As they drove through the quiet, snowy streets, Alexander noticed the small worn details of Michael's jacket, the carefully mended sleeve, the clean but well-loved look of Ben's small, knitted hat. He saw dignity in every thread. They arrived at the small 3-story building that housed their apartment. The entryway was dark. The stairwell smelled faintly of burnt oil and cold plaster. Michael apologized profusely at the door. It's small, sir, just 2 rooms. And it's not exactly pristine. Alexander simply shook his head. He stepped inside the warmth of the tiny living room. There was no grandeur, There was no expensive art, but there was life. The room was dominated by a small, slightly lopsided Christmas tree, decorated with popcorn garlands and homemade construction paper ornaments. It was a space saturated with love. The dinner was exactly as Michael had described. Warm lentil soup served in mismatched bowls, and the last of the bread they had intended to give away. Alexander sat at the small chipped kitchen table. Ben immediately placed a fourth empty wooden chair right beside Alexander. "This is your seat," he announced. It wasn't an offer of temporary hospitality, it was an act of inclusion. While Michael finished prepping the meal, Alexander noticed an electrical cord dangling precariously from the wall, where a main power socket was supposed to be. He looked at Michael. "Did you lose power here?" Michael sighed. "No, the power's fine. The socket is just broken. I've been meaning to fix it, but I haven't had the right tools or a free hour. I have to switch the lights on and off at the breaker." In that moment, Alexander saw a physical manifestation of Michael's struggle. A professional who couldn't even fix his own home due to the demands of keeping his sons safe and loved. Alexander, the man who oversaw the construction of entire power grids, reached into his briefcase, the same briefcase he used to carry billion-dollar contracts, and pulled out a small emergency toolkit he always kept for minor personal adjustments. It contained a small screwdriver and a precision wire cutter. For the next half hour, Alexander Voss, CEO, was simply Alexander, the man with a steady hand. He fixed the socket. He stabilized the wiring. The small snap of the switch, followed by the perfect, steady light, was more satisfying than any financial quarterly report he had ever signed. He looked up, and for the first time that night, he let out a loud, unguarded, genuinely happy laugh. Later, as the small family settled in, Ben, fighting the urge to fall asleep, reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small folded piece of construction paper, a brightly colored drawing of a wonky reindeer, and a man with a large, smiling face. He handed it to Alexander. "For you, I made it today." Alexander carefully unfolded the paper. On the inside, written in the same unsteady crayon as the bread wrapper, were the words, "To my Christmas friend." Alexander's eyes blurred. He didn't just receive a gift, he received a title. He was no longer the CEO, the boss, or the target. He was the friend. He was invited, genuinely, into a human circle. He held the card, a piece of art worth nothing, yet more valuable than every stock certificate he owned. He sat there, warm, fed, and completely, utterly present. Community call to, if you believe kindness matters more than money, type, "I will live kindly." The Christmas lights were finally packed away, but the light that Ben had kindled in Alexander Voss refused to fade. A few weeks after Christmas, Alexander found Michael. He did not approach him as the CEO of Voss Industries. He approached him as Alexander, the man who had shared soup and warmth. Alexander's purpose was not to offer charity, which he knew Michael would reject. His goal was partnership and presence. Leveraging his corporate resources, he found Michael a stable, high-value position as the head of facilities for a regional nonprofit foundation that Alexander quietly supported. The role required Michael's advanced electrical skills, offered a sustainable income, and guaranteed flexible hours, a job that finally respected his talent and his fatherhood. Michael accepted, his dignity fully intact. But the job was secondary to the friendship. Alexander started showing up regularly. He didn't just send gifts, he sent time. He helped Michael tutor Ben in basic math. He even bought a small, high-quality toolkit for Michael's birthday and occasionally joined him on small repair projects, enjoying the simple, honest work of fixing things. One crisp afternoon, Ben looked up at Alexander, his forehead furrowed with the kind of serious contemplation only a 6-year-old can achieve. "Will you be lonely again?" Ben asked, his voice full of genuine concern. Alexander knelt down, bringing his famous face level with the boys. The man who had lectured board members and terrorized competitors spoke with quiet sincerity. "Not if you let me be your friend, Ben. Not if you keep showing up." Ben's face broke into a glorious, gap-toothed smile. He took Alexander's hand, the small, soft glove finding the warmth of the powerful, newly humbled man. The winter began to melt into the early signs of spring. One Sunday, the three of them were walking along the Vltava River in Prague. Michael and Alexander were discussing the complicated logistics of Ben's upcoming school trip. They were easy, familiar, and comfortable together. A mismatched, chosen family unit. Ben ran ahead, a small, bright spark of energy against the gray stone of the promenade. He stopped suddenly, turning back to look at the two men walking side by side, sharing a laugh. Ben cupped his hands around his mouth, his voice echoing over the river. "Friends don't walk alone." Alexander Voss stopped. He watched the boy running toward him, the boy who had saved his life not with money but with a philosophy. He looked at Michael, his friend, who had taught his son that the richest thing a person can give is their presence. He reached out his hand, and as Ben ran up to grab it, Alexander felt the perfect, complete warmth he had been seeking all his life. Voiceover closing the loop. He had all the wealth in the world. He had built a fortress to keep the world out, only to find himself trapped inside. It took a single dad's philosophy and one small boy's offer of a cup of cocoa to remind him what Christmas is really for. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, leave a comment and subscribe to HA Stories. We tell the stories that shouldn't be forgotten.